Hello, my name is Patricia Parker. I am the founder of Kids for Kids, which supports children in arguably one of the most deprived and shockingly poverty-struck regions in the entire world, in remote villages in North Darfur, Sudan. Just to explain, I went to Sudan back in 2001, 20 years ago now, merely to see my son, who was in his first full-time job overseas for the Foreign Office, and actually to paint. I'm not medical. That's important for you to know from the start. However, it was the conditions and realising the desperate need of people in the villages that made me realise not only were they desperate for help, but actually one could do it relatively easily. So let me explain, first of all, of course, the name. I went to Sudan with my son to Darfur in March of 2001, when it was already drought. The sand was pockmarked with footprints of humans and their animals, the donkeys, the only transport. Outside the regional capital, El Fasher, there were no roads. And we were bouncing across the desert when we came across, frankly, a shocking sight. It was a little nine-year-old boy who was struggling with a big jerry can of water. A jerry can weighs 25 kilos. And when we asked him where he was going, was he lost? He said he wasn't lost, but what he was doing was collecting the water for his family. He had 4 younger siblings. And the walk took him 7 hours to reach the hand pump. Now there's water underground in Darfur, the biggest aquifer in Africa. And my first thought was, oh, for goodness sake, I could find the money to provide a hand pump. You would have done the same. But then I asked to see his mother, because I actually thought, how could that child, a little 9-year-old, survive the heat of summer? And what sort of mother could this be? So I went to the village and they explained where she was. She was camping away from the village. Nothing was growing, but she had 3 precious possessions. And when we're talking about midwives, we're obviously also talking about healthcare. And I went to find her, and she was quite extraordinary. She gave me the hospitality of the Sudanese, the only thing that she had, which was a bowl of goat's milk. That was their evening meal. And I realised that actually not only was his water keeping the little goats alive and his brothers and sisters, but the milk of those goats was actually keeping him alive. Now, I realised the extreme poverty, the extreme desperation to get a mother with her 5 little children to go and camp away because of how important those little goats were to her. But it was obvious to me too that 3 goats wasn't anything like enough. So what to do? So I went to the village and we sat with the villagers. And this is where we came to midwives, because I asked about how they lived. And one of the things that really stuck with me was the fear in the eyes of the young girls, the young teenagers. At that stage, they were getting married, being married at 13, 14, 15. And they were absolutely terrified of childbirth. And I asked what happened, what was going on. And they said, well, there isn't any healthcare, but we're very lucky. They don't like upsetting me. So they said, we're very lucky. We have a traditional birth attender. And I said, oh, what does she do? Well, she was an older lady who had survived childbirth. And when there was obstructed labour, and they couldn't get them to the hospital in time to have a Caesar. And of course, it was very late when she wasn't medically trained, that they did rope delivery. I still pause over that because the vision of it is so awful. You can imagine the baby doesn't survive, and the mother is very lucky to survive. And you know about the incidence of incontinence and how, of course, it's impossible to live with someone who has fistula in a hot country. They become literally pariahs. So I asked, well, what happens if they actually do go to hospital? Well, they go to hospital in labour, the late stages of labour, of course, by this stage, on a donkey, or on a stretcher, can you imagine, between 2 donkeys? Can you imagine that? So I actually thought, well, I better go and see the hospital. So I went to the nearest hospital, which was 80 miles away. There are only 8 rural hospitals in the whole of Darfur. Darfur is the size of France. So when you think about that, you can imagine how important this particular hospital is. 20 years ago, there was 1 doctor. Now there are 3. I went to see the hospital back 20 years ago, and I also went to see it when I went there last, which was in February 2019. And I have to tell you, the conditions are virtually the same. There are now 3 doctors, as I say. 1 doctor showed me her stethoscope, and you can see the condition of it. The operating theatres are very little better. We have provided some equipment when we've been able to get it to Sudan, but of course transport to Sudan is incredibly expensive. We have now provided a sterilising unit for the hospital, but they actually need a generator that works all the time. I went to the hospital and saw a woman who'd just had a Caesar. She and the baby were alive, but she had had that Caesar under ketamine, which, as you know, doesn't remove the pain. It just means you can't walk away. So virtually no sterilising, no oxygen, no ventilator. So, by the way, of course, COVID, there's no diagnosis of COVID, and there's no treatment. And yes, COVID is rife there, as it is elsewhere in the world. Just so you know, because I do try to provide a broad compass of projects that will make a difference properly to a family and to a village long term. So we do provide soap, 5 bars to each family. So far we've provided, we've provided 500,000, just take that in, 500,000 bars of soap that in the first year of COVID. And we continue to provide 5 bars to each family. So if you know anyone who'd like to provide soap, please let me know. But to revert to midwives, it was pretty obvious to me that it was essential to provide healthcare in the villages to prevent problems becoming catastrophes. That's what you have to do, and it happens very quickly. Incidentally, we also provide trained first aid workers. If you can get a wound treated hygienically, if you can get, sterilised instruments, etc., water boiled and so on, people won't lose their fingers, won't lose their limbs. Wounds won't become so infected, and so on. So first aid workers and midwives. And you'll probably like to know that we train two midwives in each village. That's important because they are treating their friends. And as, of course, with any childbirth, it is dangerous, or it can be. And so if there is loss or if there is a problem, it's very important that the two can back each other up. They can't ring a consultant or get extra help. They have to deal with it themselves. And of course, it means with two, you can cover for each other. And also, it prevents burnout. Something I have been amazed about is how, well, in fact, I don't know of any midwife since in the last 20 years who has actually given up her work. I find that absolutely extraordinary. The training for the village midwives actually takes place in El Fasher. We've actually built a midwife training school that can accommodate 40 midwives. That would be for 20 villages. There are over 900 villages in Darfur. I'm very lucky. Right from the start, we have shared the cost of the training with the State Ministry of Health. Although I have to say their funding at the moment is virtually nil. It costs us approximately £2,000. That's what I actually raise. That's how I raise the money for the training of a midwife. Inflation is over 400% in Darfur, so I don't know what the actual cost will be to Kids for Kids. But of course, I have to raise money for actual things. So it's very important that a lot of people, thankfully, give me funds for the greatest need. And that means I can supplement projects as and when necessary, as prices soar. But let me tell you about our wonderful volunteers. The training takes just 14 months, but it's 14 months of intense training. They have to leave their village. Many of them will not have travelled to El Fasher and will not have travelled beyond a village. A village is made up of a group of little straw huts, yes, straw huts, that the wind blows through, that have sand on the floor, and so on. Please, when you have time, do look up Kids for Kids and see the whole package of projects that we do that lift families out of abject poverty, but also transform villages. Villages that have midwives, have first aid workers, possibly a kindergarten, and indeed we also build health units where the midwives, the first aid workers, and the projects are running successfully. But the village midwives are chosen as being particularly upright, particularly honest, particularly hardworking, and indeed intelligent young girls. The training for the midwives is something I'm really proud of. It's all encompassing, and I think it shows you the importance that midwives have. And I'm sure you know how important your job is here. But in a village like Darfur, where you are the principal provider of healthcare, it goes way beyond the actual moment of birth. The girls, I know it's a short training, but as I said, it is intensive. They will help mothers with pre and postnatal care. Often the mothers are badly malnourished themselves. I actually saw a video today of a mother talking about how she couldn't feed her baby. Well, the nearest thing to mother's milk is goat's milk. And so you can see our goats come in on every level. But of course, the mothers need to teach them how to feed the babies and so on. So that's incredibly important. Another thing they do is to register the births and indeed the deaths. And in fact, during the height of the violence, our villages were the only ones that had a proper record of babies being born or indeed dying. That's a very important thing for parents, actually, that their babies are actually recognised. Something else that they do, of course, is to discourage FGM, female genital mutilation. In Darfur, mothers would get themselves sewn up again, so that the second birth can often be more dangerous than the first because of adhesions and so on. And in fact, I'm really proud that in our villages, FGM is a dying practice. One thing that happens, and I think this is fair with everywhere, is that mothers will go to, or women will go to a course, and they will listen politely to someone like me, or indeed someone like you, actually telling them about the dangers. But actually having somebody of their own actually saying to them, convincing them, is much more effective. It's not outside interference, it's not against the religion and so on. And it certainly is exceptionally effective. So I'm really proud of that, because the high incidence of orphans in Darfur was something that I found really shocking. If you're very poor and you take in another child, of course you're going to look after him or her, but you don't have much to spare. And if it's limited, your own children are going to get priority. So you can imagine the degree of desperation, and how wonderful it is that there are fewer orphans now. Something that really is also wonderful is that the fame of our midwives spreads, so that mothers come from other villages. And one of the things I think I told you about is that when the girls get qualified, we actually give them not only a uniform, a white tobe, sari, but also leather shoes, so that they are, with huge status, a pair of leather sandals. And they have equipment that we actually have to keep in tin boxes to keep the rats off. We also provide them with a crossbred donkey. A crossbred donkey is a much faster donkey than the little local donkeys, to help them get to their patients, to the huts in time. And something else that we've done is to provide donkey ambulances. It's a donkey cart with sackcloth cover across the top, and the cart, you can slide a stretcher into the cart. And I'm rather proud of myself that I realised that when the poor donkey, the overworked donkey, was taken out of the shafts, of course the cart went down and the patient had to come out. Well, there's now the Parker prop, which is a metal rod with a cup on the end, which goes underneath the shaft and holds it steady so that the patient can stay in the cart while the donkey is having a rest. And of course overnight, if they have to stop overnight and so on the journey. So small things appropriate to Darfur, but things that really work. One thing I'd like to say to you is how absolutely important it is to train midwives in Darfur. I can't tell you the impact. Your profession has huge, far-reaching impact, and you can imagine in a Muslim country how important it is for the women to feel supported. It's a huge honour to be able to do this, and if you can tell people that any help that they could give us with the midwife training school, with equipment for the hospital, with helping us fund the midwives, would have a real impact. And I have to say, this year is one of the worst I've ever known. So please do look up our website, and if you would like to donate a goat or two, or help us towards our health projects, I'd be really happy. Thank you.